Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to Reference Point. I'm your host, Dave Coker-Hook, and with me this evening is Mr. Paul Pines. We're going to have a fascinating discussion with Paul. Paul is an author, a teacher, and a psychotherapist, and we're going to tie all those things together as we discuss some of his career path changes over the years and some of his current work, and specifically a book that he's just recently released called My Brotherâs Madness, which is a memoir about his family, and we'll get into that in a few minutes. But Paul, welcome to Reference Point. Happy to have you here on the show.
I'm glad you asked.
So tell us a little bit about you, though. I mean, you and I have had a chance to talk a little bit over the phones and whatnot, and your background is quite interesting. And one of the key things that I've come to appreciate about you is that your dominant passion has been as a writer. Is that pretty well accurately stated?
Yeah, I think that perhaps every other thing I've done in my life has been in the service of my desire to write. And early on, I made choices that gave me maximum flexibility, and later on, I made other choices that took me more deeply into my material.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah.
And you've written a variety of types of things.
Right.
You've written some poetry.
6 books of poetry.
6 books of poetry. You've had, was it 2 novels?
Yeah, 2 novels published.
2 novels, and now the memoir.
Now the memoir,
And
right.
you told me that you've got some other things that are brewing out there that are coming out too.
Yeah,
And
yeah.
I thought another thing that was fascinating that you mentioned to me before the show is you have a colleague that is putting some of your poetic creations to music.
Right, correct. Dan Asia, who's a composer in residence at Tucson and at University of Arizona. We met at the McDowell Colony years ago. It was a writer's colony. And we met over the ping pong table. And we were fiercely competitive over the ping pong table. And so after playing a few games with each other, we looked at each other's work. And that collaboration is now over 30 years old.
Oh, wonderful. We
have 2 CDs out on the Summit label of his setting of my poems. And recently he's finished his 5th symphony, in which he's set some of my work with an Israeli poet, Yehuda Amichai. It's commissioned by the Jerusalem Symphony and the New York Symphony, and will premiere in November. So I'm looking forward to that.
Fabulous. That's great. So a lot of eddies here for your career. The musical side, the creative side from writing, your jazz background too. I think and it was from the book and from other things we talked about. You've had a lot of music has been a big part of your life too. And it seems like all these things come together in terms of the writing, the teaching, the music, and your current profession as well.
Well, you know, I frame it this way, to myself anyway, that since I was a child, I've been really interested in what makes people do what they do. I've been interested in what makes me do what I do, and I haven't always known why. And so the process of discovering why I do what I do and why other people do what they do has been central. And as a child, I started to read poetry, and by the time I was 10, 11, 12, I was writing it. I was looking at the blank page, and I was saying, I can say anything here. I have absolute freedom here. And that seemed to me like such an incredible opportunity. And I started to write, and as I wrote, I discovered things that I didn't know before I wrote. And there was always a sensation attached to that, a wonderful sensation of discovering something new. And I continue to do it. When I taught creative writing, I tell my students, you know, there's something erotic about this. There's something compelling. There's something that keeps people doing this. I mean, otherwise they might as well go out and get MBAs. And what keeps relatively intelligent people at this? And I conclude it's the sensation of discovery. And every discovery is a renewal. And later in life, I found that true about music. I found that true when I listened to jazz. I found that true about improvisation in any form, and particularly in jazz. And that jazz musicians, when they were improvising, were doing the same thing I was doing when I was writing a poem.
There's a high level of creativity tied into that too. You were talking about the the expression and this experiential level, and the thing that you discover by virtue of it, but the level of create that's associated with it. And in the jazz, as you were talking about, I sing, so I find it there. And clearly, when you write, whether it be poetry or a novel or whatever, I'm sure that creative element is a key component as well.
Well, when one improvises, one opens one's efforts to the spontaneous movement of mind and heart. One goes past agenda. Again, when I teach creative writing students, I warn them, I say, don't get married to your intention. If you get married to your intention, you will probably produce something fairly rigid and unexciting, whereas if you open up, and it's very hard to open up, not everybody is a good improviser. It means you don't control what comes out. And the creativity for me is in the surprise of the way things connect when you allow yourself to do that.
Interesting.
Right.
So as an author then, you are, you see if I can state this correctly, you might have an initial vision or plan of what you think might occur, what might make a great story. I think one of the books you were telling me about was a mystery novel. Yes. But it doesn't necessarily go the way that you had originally envisioned. It takes on a life of its own.
Correct. Correct. It's, it took me, for instance, 5 years to write this book. Not because I didn't know the story. I'd lived the story.
Right.
But to understand how to tell the story. To understand the best way to tell it so that what was under the surface came up to the top and revealed things about it that were exciting to me and might be exciting to others.
So you wrote this book, you said it took you 5 years to write,
Correct.
and I think you said in past October it came out. That's all, I mean, it's a story about your life and your family, but that's all. How did you come to decide that you could write this book?
Well, you know, everybody has a story. From one point of view, we all are on a journey, and it's a rather heroic journey. The issues that face us are daunting. We are born into this world with cards we didn't choose. We have a set of circumstances to which we must adapt, and after we've adapted to them, then we need to adapt to the knowledge that life is mutable and changeable and limited. So we each have this very daunting job ahead of us. And Joseph Campbell calls it the hero's journey, and we read books about heroes and how they take on their tasks and how their lives are transformed by the way they engage those tasks. And really that's the story of each of our lives. So, you know, as I looked at my own life, I looked at it both as a daunting task to take on my own personal patterns and make sense of them, my own story, but also as a way of perhaps, if done well, encouraging other people to partake of that.
We all have a different story, and what I'm from the way you stated that, it's like we each have our sense of heroics, or you know, it takes a lot to get through whatever your life circumstances are. Now, your circumstances when you and your brother were growing up were quite out of the ordinary, I guess, is a nice, safe way of stating that.
Well, you know, who was it? I think it was James M. Cain, who wrote Double Indemnity and Mildred Pierce and all those. He was a wonderful realist. He said, I write dialogue. When I write dialogue, I don't write what people say. I write what people think. And if people said what they think, the dialogue would be much more exciting between all of us.
There you go, yeah.
So, you know, I wanted to write a book in that way. I think to write a book about what we all know, what we really all say to each other, is not an exciting book. To write about what people don't normally talk about is what makes a book worth writing and worth reading. Now, when I look at my own life from one point of view, I might say, yes, it's very different, it's very unique. But from another point of view, I don't think it's so terribly different and so terribly unique. I think most lives have shadow material, dark material, problem material. My life had it, and it was very rich in darkness. And I say that in a considered way. I, as a therapist, think engaging that material is really engaging the hidden riches. Mm-hmm. And transformation only happens when one dips down into one's woundedness, into the woundedness of life. And these are the things that transform one.
So let's talk a little bit about that as it pertains to this book and how you... Let's start by just giving us an overview of what My Brotherâs Madness is about as a book. What do we actually... Pick up the book and you start reading it, what are we getting ourselves into?
Well, I wanted to write this book in some way like my first novel, which was a mystery, which was a thriller. And in the thriller, you have a corpse on page 2, and the rest of the book is spent trying to figure out how the corpse got there and explain how the corpse got there and explain this deeply inhuman act and restore some order to the universe. That's what mysteries are about and why people read them. I wanted to write a book that was true, that was memorable, and yet didn't have to partake of that convention in order to tell the story. So while there's no corpse on page 2, there are the characters of my mother and my father and the world in which my brother and I grew up. It was Brooklyn in the 40s and 50s is the setting of the story. And in the telling of the story, I had to figure out how to tell it in a way that had an intense dramatic feel. And so I played with time. Time is a tremendous tool in the way one tells a story. And I came up after a while with the idea that I would tell the story in panels of time present and time past, and have those panels play against each other, and have them enrich each other, and have the questions raised by this driven by that interplay. So the questions raised, you know, it's a story about two brothers, and that's a classic story. That's a mythic thing, two brothers, right from Genesis onto the Navajo myths. The lives of two brothers are intertwined, and in my case, I was the dark brother, the brother doomed to failure from the start. My brother was the golden child with blonde ringlets and blue eyes. And in the scenario that my father set up, my brother would become a medical success and would drive through the Bowery and save the dark brother who would be sodden in the doorway, and pick him up and save him. And my father would say to me all the time, "You'll end up on the Bowery, Paul." And the fact is I did end up on the Bowery, but not quite in that way. I had a jazz club on the Bowery. Yeah. And in these ironies of life, things often turn. And what happened was at one point, my brother, who was a very hard worker and thought of himself as the fulfiller of expectations, became aware that he could not carry that burden. He went to medical school in Belgium, studied medicine and French for about 3 years, transferred to Einstein, and 3 months before his medical degree had a nervous breakdown and never got his MD. He then went on to reinvent himself as a microbiologist at Columbia and went on to work in laboratories until a late onset paranoid schizophrenia set in and the psychosis no longer allowed him to operate. He had a full-blown delusional system in his 40s. I went from feeling that I was the black sheep, really doomed. I felt, you know, maybe they're right. But I so enjoyed my role of the doomed. The underworld always fascinated me. I loved street life. I found tremendous intelligence in street life. I set pins in a pool room as a kid. Mm-hmm. I went on to discover the beats and wrote poetry after their fashion. Ended up on the Lower East Side. I did go to college and eventually graduated. And attended bars in order to write, was a merchant seaman. I went over to Vietnam. I spent time in Vietnam. I came back. I survived Vietnam. I went into the 60s, full steam ahead. And somewhere along the line, I kind of found myself thinking what a rich life it is and how much I was enjoying that life. I lived in Central America for a while after I sold my club. And then in my 40s, I was invited up to a small town in rural New York to be an artist in residence. And I was living in Belize at the time, and I thought I'll come here for 6 months and teach and be paid for 6 months as an artist in residence, go back to Belize and live and work in Central America. Except that I met Carol, who is now my wife, and instead of going back to Belize, I stayed in small town America, and I became not a bohemian, I became an identifiably middle-class guy. And, well, identifiably, I still looked a bit different, but my lifestyle changed. At my wedding, and the book opens at this, my brother appears. He's been working as a lab bacteriologist, and he drives up to the Friends Lake Inn in the Adirondacks, my wedding, and his behavior is identifiably off. It's inappropriate, and he tells stories about people following him and people in the, and it's clearly paranoid, and but it's still a fine line. Whether some of it might be true, it's hard to tell just how off it is, but I'm concerned. At this moment, not only am I getting married, but I'm due to go to Paris because I've been commissioned to write a screenplay by a French film company based on my first novel, The Tin Angel. And so I go off to Paris with my new wife and my book and all of these things, and my brother's falling apart at home. So the book opens with his phone calls to me in Paris, and from there on, the story of our lives unfolds both in the present and in the past.
And there's a message. You and I have talked about this a little bit. The content of the book, the story of the book, is one of those things when you start reading it, you're just drawn into it. And as a story, it makes a fabulous story, but there's so much more to it. Because what we're really addressing here is this whole realm about, I guess what's affectionately referred to as mental illness, we can use that term, and the impact that it has on individuals, on families, on extended family, on friends and whatnot. And it's not just something that happens in Paul Pines and his brother Claude's life.
No, you know, mental illness is really the great theme of literature. It's in all the Greek plays. Oedipus starts with Sophocles, not with Freud. King Lear, we could call him bipolar. Hamlet, we could call him clinically depressed. You know, the great stories of our literature deal with people at the extremes of human behavior. And they were told often in ceremonial form, like the Greek tragedies, because it gave people a chance to come once a year or twice a year and experience these horrendous tales full of all the stuff of life in an acceptable form where they could experience it, have catharsis, and go back and kind of live an everyday life. So we do not easily confront on a daily basis the tragedies of our lives or other people's lives. We tend to want to edit them out. We tend to want to see things as beautiful and hopeful and immediately satisfying. The fact is, I think the percentage today is, in the United States, 26% of the population suffers a mental illness. 50% of the population will be touched by it. We have one of the highest rates of mental illness, and by that I mean clinical depression, ADD, mood disorders, psychosis, of any country in the world.
And yet we tend to put a label and a stigma on it when it's so prevalent, but we try to what,
Yeah.
ignore it or pretend it isn't really there?
I think we do both, and I think the way we are, we treat it medically. For instance, the lobbyists from the mental health world have been lobbying for years to get what they call parity passed. That is, the right for insurance companies to treat mental illnesses like physical illnesses. There's parity between them.
Mm-hmm.
Up till now, there hasn't been. One could get unlimited resources for certain physical illnesses, but very, very limited resources for mental illnesses. Mm-hmm. So even there, the bias is reflected. And it's still true. It's still true today that people who suffer from mental illnesses have a lot harder time finding insurance that will allow them to continue in the process of treating it.
Sure. Which is one of the elements that I remember coming up in the book. That theme was definitely, and of course, the book is, it's a journal, pretty much is what it is. And so how, as an author, as a creative writer, who has a powerful story to tell, in addition to wanting to take this and put it into a package so that others can experience it, what is it that you want the book to accomplish? What impact do you want the story of your life to be able to have?
Well, I want to put a human face, first of all, on mental illness, and particularly in this sense, my brother's was schizophrenia with paranoid delusion, and that's the official diagnosis. But after one has said that, the actual experience is so much richer and so much more vivid. And my brother's struggle with it and his successes with it, so much more dramatic and moving than any diagnosis can convey. And so one of the things I want to do is put a human face on it. Mm-hmm. My brother became, you know, he at first, when I had to convince him, when he was in the height of his delusion, florid delusion, paranoid delusion, he had gotten to the point where his pursuers, and he couldn't tell me who they were or why they were pursuing him, had pursued him into his dreams. Mm. And there was nowhere to hide anymore now that they were in his dream. And I convinced him at that point that he might find both safety and the answer to his question if he committed himself to a hospital. And it was a kind of trick, but we both signed on to it.
Was it a difficult thing to do for you?
Of course. But for me, it was a life and death matter. Mm-hmm. Unless I got him into a hospital, it was clear to me that he would die. He would die. He saw the world as attacking him, and what he would do in response might hurt others and himself. So he went with me and he signed himself into the hospital, and there he refused to take medication, because if you're paranoid and people are trying to give you medication, yes, it doesn't read as it does if you're not paranoid. So eventually, and this is in the book, the drama worked itself out where he did finally take the med. And he called me the next day, and his voice on the phone was the voice of a brother I hadn't heard for years. I had lost, I thought. And he invited me down. He said, "Please come down. I have something I have to tell you." And I came down, and what he said to me was, "Paula, you will never know what it's like to understand that your own mind can betray you." And I said, "No, that's not been my experience." He says, "Well, it's been mine."
Wow.
And so the story from there goes how he puts the pieces back together again, knowing that his mind can betray him. Where does he find solid ground? How does he put the pieces back together? And one of the things, and he struggles with it, like many people who have this experience, they're considered dual diagnosis, they self-medicate. People who have psychosis usually also have either alcohol or drug-related problems. Mm-hmm. So,
well, there's the side of it that we're talking about here, of the individual who has the experience, who has the challenge, and how they deal with it, knowing that, as your brother had articulated, that he can't trust his own mind.
Right.
And then there's those of us around that individual and the impact on them. And
Well, my brother went on to become a mental health advocate for part of the time. Now, he could speak about this both as someone who had medical training, who had worked on the wards, who had really dealt with patients who had the same problems he had. He also knew a great deal of neurobiology. He knew how all the medications worked. He knew the neurotransmitters. So he could speak about this experience from both sides. And people who heard him speak were deeply moved, deeply moved. And one of the things that I wanted to preserve in this book was his voice, speaking from that point of view.
Understood. We are actually at a point where we have less than 2 minutes left in the show. If you believe that time really zips by when you're having this. So I wanted to ask you to maybe summarize what is the silver lining here in this message, and what is it that we really want the rest of the world to come to grips with through this story?
Well, the silver lining is that development continues. Hope is part of this process. And in order to address the pain of mental illness, we need to open our eyes to it. We need to humanize it. We need to destigmatize it. We need to do all of those obvious things, but we need to also understand that these are potentials that exist for us as well, for our children, for our loved ones. And we need to become a less punitive culture. We need to punish what frightens us less. And I think we tend to punish what frightens us, and we tend to punish the mentally ill. My brother used to tell the story of Philippe Pinel, a doctor during the French Revolution who went down into the pits of the asylums and took the chains off all of the inmates and let them out. And he would say, "That's wonderful, but the chains now are invisible. They're still there."
They're still there, and that's, I think, that's a great point to make, and I think that's about where we're going to end off tonight. But the point to make with that is that the awareness, we want to help people become a little bit more aware, to understand the challenges, and to, I guess, accept and not try to hide and reject the fact that there are these challenges. So don't put it under the rug, put it in the light of day, and then you can deal with it. Paul, thank you very much for coming. Very much appreciate your coming out here for to do the show, and good luck with your book and your future activities as an author and creator. And for you folks out there watching, thanks for joining us at Reference Point. We'll see you next time.
Thank you.